Hey guys, Bites Bumper bringing you this Unholy Death Knight, the War Within a Mythic Plus guide. This is meant to be a, fully fleshed out Mythic Plus guide where we're going to talk about both talents, rotation, and then some other tips and tricks and, embellishments, that kind of thing. It's both, if you've never played Unholy before, this is going to be a good place to start understanding, like, how does Unholy actually deal damage in Mythic Plus? What is it that you need to focus on? What is the actual rotation? That kind of thing, right? Um, However, just a bit of a background. So how is Unholy performing at the moment? I'd say we're doing pretty well. So last time I checked on Radar.io, the highest key done was actually done with Unholy Death Knight. Obviously, early season, that kind of thing, but looking pretty strong so far. I think Unholy strength is that we have very good AoE. We scale incredibly well. We also are quite resilient to downtime. We're very tanky. We have some group utility, that kind of vibe. But in most cases, it's about the DPS, and I think Unholy can put out quite a lot. This is kind of just a random 9 I did, so this won't be your best kind of showing. I will try and put up more videos when I do a bit more high myth plus with a bit more coordination. Anyway, talents. What's going on here? So in this specific run, I'm doing kind of the classical Mythic Plus build that's recommended to the average player on the class. You can see we go and pick up, for instance, your Magus Cleave. We go both Bursting Source and Ebon Fever, and it's generally quite disease focused. Now, this is not the build that's been run by the highest keys so far. Those have been skipping the whole Apocalypse line in the middle and going for Festering Scythe, for instance. I promise I will make additional videos with that build so you can see how that plays, but this video will focus on a more classical one and talk about the rotation, even though a lot of what I talk about today can be transferred over to varying builds. When it comes to talent choice, I feel like in the class tree, it's pretty locked in. We need to pick up, for instance, Blinding Sleet. It's a good idea to have interrupt, of course, but also interrupt cooldown reduction when you do a successful one. So I tend to just leave that as is. In the spec tree, the classical build doesn't have that much choice generally. Like I think the one you can do is opt to not pick up Vial Contagion. It does add quite a lot of DCDs in your setup, which means that in general, it makes it a bit slower to get to your actual burst window. If you want to just go out and start doing DPS quicker, I recommend picking up Pestilence instead. I think it's, in an ideal scenario, it is less DPS, but if you're not doing that much damage, or if the packs die too quickly, it is a good idea. As I mentioned, I'll just show it up here. So this is the Festering Scythe build. It relies on essentially popping so many wounds that you get lots of Festering Scythes, which allows you to pop more wounds and so on. I've actually played a version of this on Brood Mythic, and I got rank 2, so it's definitely a good build there, and I think it's going to work out well in Mythic Plus. I just need to play it and try it out a bit more. Some benefits there is that you do not rely completely on Vial Contagion to do AoE damage. I'm not sure if you even pick it up. You can probably opt to not do that if you don't want to. But all right, that's it. Let's talk a little bit about your rotation and where your damage comes from. How do you do damage? What buttons matter? That kind of vibe. So first of all, we have the diseases. It's a big part of doing AoE damage. They scale linearly, so they do equal damage on every single target. So if you add loads of them, you're going to do lots and lots of damage. We pick up loads of talents that interact with our diseases, like Ebon Fever and Playbringer and Super Strain. And these really work together to make our diseases very strong in our Mythic Plus build. So the number one thing you should always think about is keeping your dots up on all the targets in a pool. This is generally quite easy to do. You have like dot transformation and race abomination applying dots automatically, but you will be pressing outbreak to keep them up, and that's kind of like also the prerequisite to press epidemic, which is your other damage button. This is your runic power spender in AoE scenarios. It scales quite dramatically when you add number of targets, because every time you hit it, every target with a dot explodes around itself, dealing damage to everything else. So you got this kind of like quadratic scaling, and it goes up to like 8 targets and then scales a bit differently. But that's also going to be a very strong one. I think important thing to notice here, it's around playing Sudden Doom procs. So Sudden Doom makes Epidemic crit automatically. So when you get that, it's just going to be spent on Epidemic relatively quickly. That also, with our standard builds, gives you tier set power because it summons some Magus, which fights the enemies, that kind of thing. Anyway, the third source of damage comes from bursting wounds, and I think this is the biggest difference compared to Dragonflight moving into Dwarven. And there's a much stronger focus on bursting wounds because now we can pick up both diseases and wounds at the same time. Back on Dragonflight, we didn't pick up wounds because it wasn't worthwhile. You lost too much single target and it wasn't actually better. However, now we do both wounds and diseases, and that means that the whole kind of active gameplay is around generating and bursting these wounds to deal AoE damage. Bursting Source, it's a famously quadratic scaling ability, and we have lots of abilities that kind of increase the number of wounds we generate by the target count, which means that you burst them and they hit everything around them, we get this quadratic scaling, which is why we do so insanely high DPS on big pools. Then we have some other things. We obviously have buff upkeep. I think that's the last kind of pillar. We talked about like the pure damage. It comes from Epidemic, diseases, and bursting swords. That's the main bit. But then we also have some buffs and things to think about. We have our Defenicate Cleave. This comes from Defile. You pop that down, it gives you Cleave in your Scourge Strike. 14 seconds maximum if you stay in it the entire time. This is what we use to burst our wounds, right? We have things like Plaguebringer. It procs off whenever you use Scourge Strike, you get 10 seconds of your dot, dealing essentially double damage. That's something to keep track of. You can see it up here in my week or pack. By the way, you can get that if you want to. If you sub to me on Twitch, join my Discord, and then you can just download that if you like these kind of buff tracking stuff I have. We have things like Icy Talons and Death Rot and Festamite. They are generally quite passive. If you just execute your rotation normally, they're going to be kept up by their own. Right. So how do we actually execute this in reality, right? Well, when we enter a given pack, we have a couple of goals we want to achieve before we kind of go into our burst mode. First thing is we want to make sure everything has a dot on them. That will generally be accomplished by pressing Raise Up Formation, which we use whenever it comes up, or Dark Transformation. Both of these apply dots, which means that you don't actually need to actively apply them. Also, we want to get our Plaguebringer going. I'll do this very quickly. So essentially, as soon as I come into the pack, I will hit a Naked Scourge Strike just to get Plaguebringer going and get my dots hitting hard. We also want to get our Cleave up and going. So Defile with this build, I forgot to mention this earlier, but we always play with Rider Apocalypse. Defile has such a short cooldown that we can essentially keep 100% uptime on the Cleave buff. So what I tend to do is when I run towards the pack, I pop down Defile here, go in and hit Scourge Strike. It gives me both the Scourge Strike Cleave, which allows me to execute my burst later on. Does lots of damage on its own, gives me a bit of a haste buff, and gets Plaguebringer going. Next task is to set up our wounds. And this is done using primarily Vile Contagion in this classic build. So Vile Contagion, how that works is that you use it on a target. It then spreads the number of wounds you have on that specific target to up to 7 enemies around it. So it generates an absolute ton of wounds, right? You got 6 wounds maximum, 7 targets, that's 42 wounds in a single button. That is a lot of damage being generated by just pressing that. So the game plan is to stack up 6 wounds in a single enemy and then hit Vile Contagion. Every 1.5 minutes is going to be super easy because we have Unholy Assault that gives you 4 wounds. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit Unholy Assault on one of the enemies. Generally, when we use Unholy Assault, we also have Raise Up Formation available. So we're going to make sure we also press that, and that's going to apply wounds on its own, which means that when you have those up, you essentially just need to use one Unholy Assault and then it's fine, right? You don't need to care about it. When you don't have Raise Up Formation ready, you're going to use Festering Scythe. I tend to just use 2. It can give you between 4 and 6 wounds. You might proc some from your pest as well. But as a general rule, I wouldn't use more than 2 because it delays your burst too much. Once you set up the wounds, you're going to hit your Vile Contagion. That's going to spread your wounds. And then you move into actual burst phase. Here, it's going to be spamming Scourge Strike. Scout Strike, it hits all enemies when you have when you're standing on Death and Decay, and as I said, we are gonna have that buff all the time. We're gonna make sure we have it up all the time. So every time you hit your Scout Strike, that's gonna hit a target, burst a wound on every one of them, and each wound is gonna hit everything around it. And it's just so much DPS. And that's gonna be like the priority button. Whenever we can, we want to hit Scout Strike to burst wounds. So if you have any wounds in the pack, prioritize Scout Strike. The one exception is if you do have Sudden Doom procs, you want to use Epidemic. Spend those Sudden Doom procs because 1, they spawn little Magi that do AoE, and 2, they give you a haste buff from the tier sets, right? So you do actually want to spend those when they come up. That does change a little bit if you... well, I think all builds are going to run this, so that's always going to be true. Anyway, this kind of period after you set up your wounds, it's just going to be spamming Scout Strike. You're going to make sure you use Outbreak to keep up your dots. You're going to use Epidemic whenever you can't use Scout Strike, or if you don't have any wounds on anything at all, or if you have a Sudden proc, right? Or maybe I already said that. That's going to be the vibe. Like, after you've done all the setup, you're essentially going to be hitting like 4 buttons. Outbreak for your dots, Defile when that ends, that finishes, Scout Strike when you can and burst your wounds, and then Epidemic as kind of like the filler. And that's, I would say, is Unholy AoE in a nutshell. Alright, so I can't remember if we actually... no, we did actually kill this guy on the first try. Anyway, we're obviously in the boss here. The rotation here is a lot simpler than in AoE. You kind of just press your cooldowns when they come up. Build your wounds, burst your wounds. Use your death call to spend your rune power. And that's pretty much it. Also keep up your dots. I don't think there's too much. Like, if you want to focus a bit more on single target, I recommend looking at my beginner guide, for instance. But for Unholy, it is much more straightforward because, yeah, you don't need to do this same kind of setup. An important thing is just pressing cooldowns when they come up. Make sure to not go to 0 wounds or 6 wounds. Don't overcap in rune power. That's the kind of vibe. All right, I thought so. We talked about this in theory. I will put up, so I have the actual opener here to the right, so you can actually see that. We're going to have a look at some packs and see exactly how I execute it in practice. So we have it, yeah, on file, essentially. This specific dungeon, I feel like it does have a good potential for Unholy because there are some pools that are really, really big. But I said it wasn't the cleanest of dungeons, which I feel like is why we lost some DPS. Anyway, before that happens, let's talk a little bit about gear, stats, that kind of thing. So when it comes to stats, Unholy and single target, it's all about haste and mastery. However, in AoE, haste gets a bit devalued because a lot of your pets do actually not do any AoE damage, right? Your Razor Abomination doesn't do AoE, your Apocalypse Ghouls don't do AoE, and also your dots don't scale with haste at all. This means that haste gets a bit devalued and crit becomes a bit more valued. So if you want to get a better deal, I recommend running roughly equal amounts of haste, mastery, and crit in Myth Plus. I feel like Myth Plus stat priority is all a bit iffy because there's not that many great ways of doing very good sims in Myth Plus, but that's what I recommend. By the way, classic opener. By the way, this thing over here, that shows you what I've just been pressing. So if you want to follow my rotation, you just look at that. That's not like a key or anything. It's showing you the actual buttons I've been pressing. And you can see here that Scout Strike is a very common button to press. I have my cooldowns up here. Did 4 million burst. Pretty good. And again, started out with the Defile Scout Strike. Use all my cooldowns. Spread wounds with my Vile Contagion. And then just spam Scout Strike to burst all those wounds. That's the very quick, easy way of looking at it. When it comes to gear, I think embellishments are what's talked about primarily. I would recommend running double Dawn Thread lining. That's the one that gives you crit when you're high HP. That's going to have a good uptime in AoE, which means that you get loads of value from it. And crit is also a good AoE stat, so that's kind of thing. I use Apocalypse here. This is a build with Apocalypse. I tend to just use that after I use Vile Contagion. It spawns some Magi to hit the enemies, but also gives me runes back, which allows me to be more efficient with my Scout Strike spamming. If you're running the Festering Scythe build, you don't need to care about that. You're just going to go straight into Scout Strike spamming. And if you don't have any wounds, it's fine. Oh, any runes, sorry. It's fine, because you can always press Epidemic, and that is actually a very strong button as well. If you're running Festering Scythe, I would just press that as soon as it comes up. Like, it generates lots of wounds. Ideally, you don't want to use it when everything has 6 wounds already, because that's going to waste a lot of them. But just use it when it comes up and you don't have a fully stacked wound count and everything. I think it does a lot of damage on its own. Like when I had a look at my brood log, I didn't get rank 1 unfortunately, rank 2 that time, but Festering Scythe was like 80% of my damage. It was the third ability in the ability order kind of thing. All right, so I do believe I've covered everything important there. Do leave a comment down below. Let me know what you thought about this video. If you want, you can ask me any questions at all. I will happy to answer them in the comments, or anything you want to see. As I said, I promise I will do a video specifically on the Festering Scythe build and exactly what's different and how that plays out. That kind of way, right? Upvote, downvote, do consider subscribing. I do like to see that number go up, and it helps you see when I actually put out some videos, that kind of thing. Upvote, downvote, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.